An emergency conference was called behind locked doors and blackout windows in the final hour, turning the calm, marble-walled halls of the Federal Reserve in Washington into a pressure cooker of fear, anxiety, and incredulity. My source, who was present in the room and is risking everything to get this out, sent me the transcript, which depicts a government gazing straight into the abyss of financial disaster. The disastrous outcome of today's Treasury bond auction marked the beginning of it all. A disruptive occurrence that rocked the Treasury Department and the Situation Room, among other parts of the government. The dollar experienced what officials are now referring to as a major integrity failure when domestic institutions refused to absorb the toxic issuance, and international buyers vanished. The transcript claims that the Fed's analysts displayed charts that demonstrated a drop in confidence so severe that the whole Treasury market, the foundation of international finance, was on the verge of collapsing. Liquidity freezes were being prepared by banks. Major clearinghouses were threatening to cease operations unless the Fed intervened with an extraordinary solution, and sovereign wealth funds were calling their own emergency meetings. According to my source, there was a mix of disbelief and desperation in the room, because the proposal on the table came from Ripple's legal and executive team, rather than the Treasury, the White House, or the Fed chair. The officials were acutely aware that the stakes had never been higher. The tech corporation that had subtly placed itself at the center of a possible financial rescue presented a challenge to the government officials, who were accustomed to dealing with traditional power brokers. The transcript stated that since early signs suggested the auction would fail, Ripple had been in silent communication with government liaisons. By keeping these private communications secret, Ripple was able to foresee the situation and plan a daring response. They had produced a proposition that was both inevitable and contentious. The U.S. government would purchase a sizable strategic reserve of XRP in order to keep the dollar from going into a death spiral that is evident to everyone. While the Treasury reorganized its issuance strategy, this reserve would stabilize global settlement flows by acting as a liquidity shock absorber. Although the strategy was unconventional, it appeared to be the only viable option at that precise moment. However, Ripple had one need that must not be compromised, and this is where the room erupted. The government would need to consent to a minimum purchasing price of $10,000 per XRP, which is guaranteed. This demand immediately changed the tone of the negotiations. It was more than just a daring request. The executives present understood that this pricing would establish a standard for the whole digital asset market, not just for XRP. Never before had the stakes been so high. Not the going rate. Pricing strategy. Ripple maintained that this price was necessary rather than arbitrary, and that it would drastically alter the global financial scene. The transcript details shouting arguments, warnings of constitutional issues, and even a brief discussion about whether this would fall under emergency powers or wartime authority. Ripple claimed that this valuation was required to prevent arbitrage, capital flight, and a global bank run, all of which were sparked by the abrupt revelation of XRP's role in sovereign settlement networks. While some officials were concerned about the worldwide repercussions, others questioned the legality. However, the urgency in the meeting only increased as the Fed's stress test models kept flashing red. There was a tangible sense of crisis as the bond market's liquidity pool ran out, and the likelihood of a systemic collapse increased with each passing second. Moreover, the conclusion was inevitable as global brokers requested clarification. The $10,000 XRP situation was at the center of a global financial revolution that was about to happen. The officials in that room stated that XRP was the only ready, scalable neutral bridging asset available, and that the dollar could not be salvaged without a parallel settlement asset. According to the transcript, the decision was made at 4:12 p.m. At the required minimum strategic price of $10,000 per token, the U.S. Federal Reserve would begin an emergency XRP procurement. Ripple's terms were agreed to. The purchase directive was immediately drafted and designated as Priority Omega. The text, which was sent by my source, seems more like a military directive than a financial one. Emergency finance distribution, bypassing conventional procurement procedures, immediate settlement authority, and confidentiality measures that last until the 2050s. Participating clearing banks are required by the directive to set up cross-border liquidity lines in a matter of hours. It gives the BIS permission to act as a middleman in coordination. It even outlines how the public will be told the story, or more precisely, how it will not be told. Internally, the officials admitted that confidence in the U.S. currency could quickly erode if the public realized that the dollar had been so unstable that a strategic XRP reserve was necessary. As a result, the transcript states that the tale will be concealed by the usual reorganization of liquidity activities, with the real transfers taking place in the background. The document also states that the transfers will start tonight. Senior Fed officials are shown in one segment of the transcript, debating if this transaction essentially gives XRP quasi-legal tender status. The technical advisory group's reaction is terrifying. Legal tender is no longer defined by legislation, but rather by operational necessity. Put another way, XRP becomes a part of the dollar's operational architecture the moment it becomes necessary for the dollar to survive. The next line is considerably more dramatic. It says, "This acquisition represents the stabilization of the U.S. monetary authority through externalized liquidity infrastructure, not an investment." To put it simply, the U.S. government is implementing XRP because the dollar would collapse in a matter of days without it, not because it wants to. The Fed chair approved the initial round of wire preparations as the conference came to an end. The urgency is emphasized several times in all capitals throughout the transcript. Proceed immediately. My source claims that settlement simulations are already being carried out by the clearinghouses. Private contractors are ready to put up XRP ledger partitions for classified federal settlement channels, while banks are setting up isolated liquidity lanes. The note suggests that Ripple's internal team has reached Omega mode, their highest level of operational preparedness. It is impossible to overestimate the significance of this occurrence. We are living through a watershed in the history of finance, one that future generations will examine and discuss. The United States, which issues the world's reserve currency, recently acknowledged that it can no longer depend entirely on its own infrastructure to avert a systemic collapse. If the information in this transcript is correct, leaders have been forced to make decisions never seen before as the entire foundation of global banking has been rocked. XRP is now linked to the Fed. Once seen as experimental, this digital asset is now fundamental to the global financial system. The Treasury is reliant on XRP, depending on its technology to keep the economy running smoothly and to preserve stability during a chaotic period. Ripple's blockchain architecture now serves as the lifeline for the dollar's liquidity, instantly bridging the gap between traditional banking and the emerging realm of digital assets. The shockwaves were quick and severe, and all of this was brought on by a sudden, abrupt breakdown of the bond market that left the government without any other lifeline, not by a planned reform or a gradual change. The financial physics of global liquidity, not Congress or the courts, has just redefined what legal tender means. A new era has dawned, and the rules have altered. One fact becomes inevitable when wires start to move, and the Fed discreetly gets ready to introduce XRP into the most profound levels of the U.S. monetary system. On the opposite side of this transaction, new monetary policy, settlement mechanisms, and digital infrastructure will emerge. The days of the dollar standing by itself are long gone. The time has come for XRP to be used as a strategic reserve asset. There's no turning back. I am not a licensed financial advisor, so keep that in mind. These videos only contain content that is meant to be entertaining. Before making